It was mid-December. I was only 17 at the time, and every year just before Christmas week, my mom had to go on a 3-day business trip for work. Being an only child that lived just with my mom, I'd spend these days that she was gone home alone. Usually she'd leave just before winter break, so I'd be in school for most of the day. But this year she left the same day that our school let out for the holidays. I had the house to myself and wanted nothing more than to stay inside and chill all day. Our city was going through somewhat of a snowstorm, so I couldn't really leave the house anyway. I made some of the food that was left for me and found a new movie to watch. I had to pause it several times throughout the couple hours though, because the wind and snow would suddenly pick up and get really loud. It seemed like every time I looked outside, the weather was worse. Then, around 7 or 8, someone was walking up to the front door. I could hear their footsteps kicking against the snow, and they coughed several times as they slowly made their way up to the porch. I didn't have a clue who it could be. I paused everything and looked at the door, waiting for them to knock or ring the doorbell. As more time passed though, I could feel myself getting nervous, as something didn't feel right. I want to say I waited 3 or 4 minutes, not hearing anything, before I went up to the door and looked outside. Nobody was there. I could see the footsteps coming right up to the door, then going back the way they came. I was really confused how clearly I heard them walk up, but somehow I didn't hear them leave. Also, with the snowstorm outside, what reason could someone have to come up to my house? I think the only reason I could settle on was that the snow made it difficult to see, and they mistook my house for theirs. Maybe they realized once they got up to the porch and didn't want to alarm anyone, so they quietly left. It's probably a bit of a stretch, but I guess it was possible. After a while, I'd mostly stopped thinking about the situation and was more caught up worrying about the storm. The power cut out a few times, lasting for several minutes before it came back on. Because of that, I couldn't really watch TV or anything, so I just sat on the couch and scrolled on my phone. It was maybe around 11, when through the harsh wind, I heard a thump against the house. I initially ignored it, but only a few moments later, the power cut out again. Thinking the thump might have caused it, I got up. It sounded like it was from the side near the kitchen, so I turned my phone light on, then walked over and looked around. I thought it was probably just a coincidence that the power shut off right after I heard the thump, but I just wanted to be sure nothing happened. I didn't see anything, and I started to walk away. Hey! I jumped and looked at the back door, seeing a man standing against the other side. The back porch light wasn't on, so he was mostly covered by the dark. I could only see his face peering in at me. Hey, kid, would you get the door for me? It's freezing out here, he said, putting his hand on the door and trying to open it. My head wasn't fully grasping the situation yet, and I kind of just stood there and stared at him. Kid, get the door, please. Something gave me a bad feeling. I knew better than to trust this guy, even though it was a blizzard outside. The man started coughing, and I started to back up, and the man's face instantly fell into a disturbing frown. Open the fucking door, he yelled, banging his fist against it several times. I ran back to the couch and got my phone. I then stood in the hallway and watched the man as I dialed 911. My phone was struggling to hold service and kept dropping the call, but after a few tries, I was able to get through long enough to ask for help. The man at the door continued to yell at me and hit the door, but eventually ran off. I'm assuming the snowstorm caused some trouble for the police, as they didn't make it until nearly 30 minutes after. I told them what I could, and I called my mom to let her know what happened. Nobody really knew what to think of it. He could have been stalking me and trying to guilt me into letting him in, or he could have actually been in need of help, although it's unlikely. I never saw him again after that night, though. I had visited my family for the holidays and was driving back home. The trip in total was about 10 hours, which I split into 2 drives on the way up. But on the way back, I decided to power through it in one long drive. Around the halfway point, snow started coming down. It wasn't too much, so I wasn't worried about it. However, it got worse as I kept driving. Once I was 3 hours away from home, it was pouring down pretty heavily, and with the sun going down as well, it definitely was not ideal. There were almost no other cars out though, which is the only reason I decided to keep driving. The snow made it harder, but I was still on track to be home by the end of the night. It was just after the sun had fully set, and about 30 minutes out from the nearest town I just passed through, that I noticed a car on the road ahead of me. Their headlights were the only light on the road in the middle of the blanket of snow covering everything else, and as I got closer, it was clear that they were stuck, or at least not moving. Their car was sideways on the road, with their hazard lights flickering, and a man was standing out in the cold next to it. Obviously, with the snow and cold, I really didn't want to stop, but it seemed I didn't have a choice. His car was blocking most of the road off that was paved. I parked just behind him. The man immediately started waving at me and walked up to my window. "My car slid and got stuck there. Can you help me push it out?" He spoke slowly, like his English wasn't the best, but hoping I could get back on the road as soon as possible, I agreed to help him. The car didn't really look like it was in too much snow, so maybe just a little push might actually be enough. I threw my hat and gloves on, then got out. The wind hitting my face and snow instantly soaking me made me wonder why the guy even got out of his car and didn't just call for help. My face and hands were already getting numb, so I hurried to the back of his car and waited for him to get his gloves. It was too dark to see anything through the windows, and after a little bit of standing back there waiting, I looked around to see what was taking him so long. He was still leaning into the front seat, as if looking for his gloves, but I thought I heard him talking. A second later, he came back out and looked at me. Were you talking to me?" I asked. He looked concerned, but said he was just talking to himself. He smiled, then walked around to the back to help me push. I couldn't help but feel like something had changed though. His whole demeanor and the situation just felt different. Although I didn't hear what he said, it didn't really sound like he was talking to himself. But if someone else was in the car, then why was he out here alone and asking for my help? All these thoughts came rushing through my head, and I guess for a few seconds I was kind of spaced out. So much so that I didn't notice the man staring at me. His smile had dropped, and he had an eerie look in his eyes, like they were hollow and lifeless, completely opposite of what he looked like before. I didn't even hesitate, beginning to hurry back to my car. Just then, several doors from the car I was just behind opened, and 3 more men got out, rushing toward me. I sprinted into my driver's seat, and thank goodness I left my car on, because I put it straight in drive and rolled past them, almost hitting one on the way out. I was terrified of possibly getting stuck in the snowbank, as the path around their car was very thin, but thankfully I made it around and was able to get away. I put in a report with the police at the closest town, but there were never any updates as far as I know. I'm assuming the men weren't really stuck and probably left right after I did. I don't know what those men were up to. Of course, I have my guesses, But if I had stayed and didn't leave right when I did, who knows where I'd be. This was last year. It was late November, and this was the first snowfall of the season. It wasn't supposed to be anything too much, just a couple inches of snow. I got home from work around 8, and by then the snow had already started. I heated up some leftover pizza and stayed downstairs for a couple hours. Around 10, I went upstairs to my bedroom, sitting at my desk with my laptop. Before I could even open up something to watch, I heard something right above me. It sounded like a thud in the ceiling. I thought it was likely the snow weighing down on the roof and was probably nothing to be concerned about. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't concerned at all, though. This was my first winter at this house, and it wasn't in the best shape, so part of me was a little worried about any possible leaks or other problems that could happen with the snow. I tried to not think about it too much and continued looking for something to watch, but then it happened again. A thud resonating through the ceiling. I looked up, and the thuds continued, sounding almost in a straight line across the ceiling. I was genuinely worried now. I got up and grabbed my winter jacket, then hurried out the front door and looked up at the roof. Unexpectedly, the side of the roof that my bedroom was under, there was no snow on it. It had all slid off and fell into a pile in front of the house. I looked at the other side of the roof, and the snow was still there. I then looked at my neighbors' homes, and all of them still had snow sitting on their roofs like normal. The way the snow had fallen off just one side of my roof didn't seem natural, like something was either wrong with my roof or something else had made this happen. Probably whatever those thuds were that I was hearing. With no more answers to find outside, and my whole body starting to shiver from the cold, I walked back to the front door. I opened it and hurried inside, stomping my boots on the doormat. When I looked up, though, my heart almost stopped. There were puddles of water going across the hallway. I stayed still and looked around, seeing water going through the living room and even up the stairs next to me. It only took me a second to see a boot print in one of the puddles, and I immediately turned right back around and headed out the door. I stood by the road and called the police, shivering as I tried to tell them my situation. About 30 seconds into the call, I saw something move past one of the windows in my bedroom, and moments later, a figure stood behind the glass, looking down at me. They only stayed for a second, then backed away. I didn't see anything else the rest of the time that I waited for the police. As I was waiting, though, I put together most of the pieces in my mind. Someone had made it up on the roof, making the snow fall as they walked across. There were several windows they could have gotten in from that I honestly had no idea if they were locked or not. When police arrived, they didn't find the intruder inside anymore, but they basically confirmed my theory. There were multiple trees going over top my house that anyone could easily climb, and with the windows being accessible, it made for an easy target. At least, the officers think that that's the reason they broke in, just because I was an easy target. Nothing was missing though, and the way the shoe prints went through the whole house felt eerily like them looking for me. What's crazy is that I must have gone outside to check on the roof at the exact time they got in through the window. If I was any later, I would have been face to face with them, or if I'd gone back inside sooner, they might have not left tracks through the house yet for me to immediately notice. It's been nearly an entire year since this, and so far nothing else has happened. Maybe it was just a one-time attempt, but I don't think I'll ever feel safe with all the uncertainties of what happened that night.
holiday gift from a stranger. Receiving anonymous gifts leading up to the holidays might sound sweet, maybe even romantic, but in my case, it was neither. Instead, it was a living nightmare that all started on December 1st. I'm Diana, a 25-year-old living in a quiet rural town in Vermont. This story took place shortly after I moved out of my family home to live alone in a small, one-story house. I hadn't met anyone in the neighborhood, and with my family and friends living across the state, I was largely on my own. So when I came home from my job at a local hardware store one evening and I saw the package waiting on my front porch, I didn't think much of it until I noticed there was no return address. The box was neatly wrapped in bright holiday paper and topped with a simple white ribbon. Taped to the front was a card that read, "To Diana, from the one that cares deeply about you." I didn't like that. I hadn't told many people about my love, and no one I knew would drop something off without heads up. The fact that someone had called all the way to a secluded cabin without telling me, yeah, that felt off. Curiosity get the best of me, and I brought the box outside. At first I thought about throwing it out, but then I heard the sound coming from the inside package. Soft, muffled, almost like a tiny cry. My pulse quickened without hesitating. I tore off the wrapping paper and ripped open the box. Inside, curled up in a small bed of blankets, was a puppy. A tiny shivering puppy with wide, scared eyes. I stared at it, trying to wrap my mind about what I was seeing. Who would leave a puppy like this in a freezing cold? I immediately scooped the poor thing up and checked to see if he was okay. It was breathing, though weakly, and I knew I needed to get to a vet right away. Driving into town, the whole thing just didn't sit right with me. Sure, people knew I was living out here, but not many, and certainly no one would surprise me with something like this. After a quick examination at the emergency vet, they gave me some medication and told me that the puppy should be fine with a little care. Relieved, I brought him home and settled on naming him Scott. The relief didn't last long. When I got back to the cabin, I found a note taped to the front door. It was written, hand neat, looping letters. "Hope you like the puppy. He'll be our little family someday." The note was unsettling. Who the hell was this from? In our family? No. That was way over the line. I took a picture of the note with my phone and tore it down. Inside, I double-checked every door and window, making sure they were locked. However, the fear lingered. The note creeped me out so much that I didn't get any sleep that night. The next morning went same as always, only now I had a puppy. I woke up an hour early to get some supply for Boxy, all the necessities before heading off to work. It was a fairly good day at work. I almost had forgotten about the previous day events, but that didn't last long. I sighed when I walked up in my front steps and saw yet another present waiting for me. The sticky note this time said, "Get ready, there will be one every day until Christmas." Again, I took a picture before touching it and then brought it inside. I wasn't going to throw it in case another living creature was inside. Clearly this person was capable of anything. But no animal this time. Instead, it was a lingerie with a note that read, "I can't wait to see in this." Ah, gross. I took pictures of the content and shoved the box into the back one of my closet, just in case I needed proof. Proof of what? I didn't know, but I watched a lot of true crime shows and I couldn't be too careful. The next day rolled out, and this time I wasn't shocked to find a present on my doorstep. I didn't like that someone was leaving me gifts, but also knew that going to police would probably end up with nothing being done. What was I going to tell them? Help, someone's leaving me Christmas presents on my doorstep. They'd probably laugh me out of the building. Instead, I decided to do some investigating on my own. I bought a Ring doorbell. I was intent on finding who the person this was and why they were leaving me gifts. The doorbell was installed next morning just in time before the third package arrived. Only what I caught on camera was a man dressed in black, wearing masks to cover his face. He even waved at the camera without saying anything. He set the package on the ground and left. When I got home, I took the package inside and opened it. This time, the present wasn't so innocent. It was a picture of me sitting in my living room watching TV. It had obviously been taken from outside the window and it was framed. You could see his reflection in the window in the picture. The fear I felt seeing that was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. The note on read, "Someday, soon, I'll be in the picture sitting next to you, not watching you from outside." That's when I realized it was time to call the police. I did, and they sent a detective over. They were worried about the possibility of me being stalked, but it was hard for them to do anything without knowing who this guy. They told me to call them whenever I got the new package and to wait for an officer before I opened it. The next 2 weeks went by without a single gift or note, and I was relieved, thinking this nightmare was finally over. Wishful thinking, though. On December 18th, I got another present left on my porch. I called the sheriff's office, and they had an officer open within 30 minutes. He took pictures of everything and watched as I opened a box. Inside was just a note that said, "You got the police involved? Why? I'd never hurt you. Big mistake, Emily." The officer took it as evidence, and I was left at home alone to be paranoid. I kept all curtains shut from then on. I constantly felt like someone was watching me. The next few days I got gifts every day, but this time it was just normal stuff. A teddy bear, a sweater, a purse, things like that. Then Christmas rolled around and I was faced with the most disturbing present of them all. I can even call it a present because of how gross and insane it was. I called the officer over like I had done many times before. Only this time we realized there was a red substance leaking from inside the box. The officer asked me to open it on the porch instead of bringing it inside, and he filmed it instead of taking pictures. The whole time I was praying it wasn't blood, but of course it was. Inside the box was a severed piece of the man's body. One no one would ever want to lose. I don't want to say exactly what it was, but you can assume. I screamed and began to cry as the officer called for backup. The detective that came by called a local hospital to let them know if anyone came in with the type of injury they were looking for, because that would have been the guy. Just like they predicted, a man with self-inflicted injury, just like the one described to the hospital staff, came in, begging for medical attention. He was arrested and wheeled off for surgery. When he woke up the next day, he told the detectives that he never meant to scare me, and it was a gesture of his undying love. He was charged with, but was considered unfit for trial due to insanity, obviously. I guess he really didn't know what he was doing wrong. He admitted that he had chosen me at random when he saw me walk out of my office building and just thought I was pretty. It was by far the worst Christmas of my life, but the best Christmas was knowing that he'd be put in a mental institution for at least the next 6 years. He needed help, and I needed to know that he'd leave me alone. I almost got kidnapped on the holiday. My name is Eerie, and at the time I was 22 years old. My family had gathered at my cousin Megan's cabin up in the snowy mountains of Colorado for the holidays. We always spent Christmas together, and that year was no exception. The cabin was tucked away in a small quiet town near Steamboat Spring, surrounded by towering pines and heavy snowdrifts. It was the Friday before Christmas Eve, and my younger brother Caleb and I, both single and restless, decided to head into town to check out some of the local bars. Caleb had just turned 19, but he'd borrowed our cousin's old ID to pass for 21. We heard about a couple of holiday-themed parties happening at bars nearby, so we figured it would worth be a shot. The first place we tried was a small, cozy bar called The Lodge. The whole place was decked out in Christmas lights, and most of the people inside wore festive sweaters or Santa hats. The problem was, as soon as we got to the door, the bouncer didn't even look at Caleb's ID before waving us off. It was freezing outside, so rather than stand in the cold and argue, we decided to move to another place farther down the road. We ended up at a bar called Snowdrift, where we got into without trouble. Inside, garland hung from the rafters and Christmas music played softly in the background. While I was ordering a drink, Caleb caught the eye of an older woman sitting at a bar. She was probably in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, and after a few minutes, I noticed they were deep conversation. I didn't think much of it, but I overheard her compliment on his strong build and rugged good looks. To me, it felt weird, a little of course, but Caleb seemed more than happy with the attention. The woman was wearing a bright red Santa hat and a tight-fitting Christmas sweater that was a bit too revealing for the snowy weather. She had a flashy grin and a voice that was too loud for quiet space. They talked for what seemed like forever, and I ended up chatting with a couple of locals at the bar to pass time. Eventually, Caleb tapped me on the shoulder and told me he was going to leave with a woman. I raised an eyebrow, but he seemed excited, so I let him go, figuring he'd be fine and stay at a bar for another half an hour before calling a ride share back to the cabin, assuring Caleb would be having a better night than I was. About halfway through the drive back, my phone rang. It was Caleb. I answered, but all I could hear was static and muffled voices. For a moment, I thought it might be a pocket dial, but then I heard a man's voice, low and rough, saying something I couldn't make out. Suddenly, I heard another man shout something in the background, followed by Caleb's voice screaming my name and yelping for help. My heart sank as the line went dead. I was under the impression he was alone with a woman. I tried calling him 10 times, and finally someone picked up. But it wasn't Caleb. It was the voice of some older man with an extremely deep voice. When I asked who this was, he said he found the phone on the sidewalk. I asked him if he could drop the phone at my uncle's place or he could meet me somewhere. He didn't answer that. I just heard talking in the background, and then I heard screaming. It was Caleb's voice. He was screaming my name, screaming for help. "Aaron, help, please!" Then the call disconnected. I immediately told the driver to pull over, and as I tried calling Caleb back again and again, the driver asked me what happened. I explained the situation to him, and he urged me to call the police. That's exactly what I did. The police came to my uncle's place, where I woke up my family up, informing them that Caleb was in trouble. I had to give my best description of the woman's appearance at the bar, and what time he left the bar. Then my dad and I, along with the police, went to the bar where we were at, and it was then that I got a phone call from a random number. It was Caleb. He was out of breath, gasping in the tune, explaining that he was kidnapped and barely escaped. He was currently using a stranger's phone. All of us went to Caleb's location, which was a sketchy street somewhere up north from the bar, Snowdrift. When we found him, his face was a bloody mess. He had 2 black eyes, and all of his possessions that he had on him were stolen. He gave his whole story. He left with a woman who claimed to have called an Uber. When the alleged ride arrived at their pickup point, which was in some quiet back alley area, Caleb found out once inside the car that it wasn't in fact an Uber. It was a trap. There were 2 men in the car who immediately held him down and threatened him to shoot if he didn't keep quiet. They started to drive him for a while, and during this time one of the men called my number. They threatened him if he yelled out anything, which he did. And that explained the bloody face and black eyes. They broke his phone and took his wallet, keys, and whatever else was on him. As the car was stopped, He wasn't being held down anymore. He ran for it out of the car. They didn't chase him. The car just sped off and disappeared. He said he believed they were going to kill him and dump his body somewhere if he didn't run. Police apparently were never able to identify the woman who appeared in the video footage from the bar. Caleb said none of the men were wearing masks, which was more reason he thought they'd kill him. Caleb had returned home safely, but a whole holiday weekend was ruined. On Christmas night, we were all jolted awake by his screams in the middle of the night. He was shouting, "She's in the house!" I rushed to wake him from whatever nightmare he dropped in. But his words stuck with me. Hearing him scream, "She's in the house," brought back the memory of her creepy smile, and I ended up sleeping with one eye open for the rest of the night.
Crazy Santa Man. I never trusted those volunteer Santas standing in front of the gas stations, jingling their bells for donations. There was something off about the whole thing. Maybe it was the way their costumes always looked cheap, like they were thrown together last minute. Or maybe it was just the fact that 5 different Santas could be standing across 2 city blocks. Didn't that confuse the kids? It was Christmas Eve, 1998, and the first time I'd be spending the holiday alone. My dad had just passed away that summer, and I didn't have it in me to join the rest of my family for a Christmas get-together. Instead, I chose to stay behind in my rented house, all alone in the strange city. The plan was simple. Keep it low-key. A small fire, some instant noodles, maybe a bottle of whiskey. I had no desire for a fancy meal or presents that year. Around 10 p.m., I realized I didn't have any noodles left. The nearest gas station was a 10-minute walk through the snow-covered back roads, and without a car, I had no choice but to bundle up and make that trek. The walk there was quiet. The snow muffled every sound, and the cold air bit at my cheeks, but I didn't mind. There was something peaceful about it. When I stepped inside the gas station store, I was greeted by the sound of overly cheerful holiday music blaring from an old radio. I grabbed my noodles and other groceries, paid the half-asleep clerk, and headed back out into the frigid night. No sooner had I left the store than I heard the faint jingle of bells. A volunteer Santa stood in my path, ringing a bell and asking for donations for the local children's hospital. I had no cash on me and told him so politely. But he didn't back off. Blocking the sidewalk, he insisted I shouldn't be selfish on Christmas, that it was all for the kids. When I mentioned I only carried a credit card, he pulled out his phone with one of those card-swiping attachments and told me I could donate that way. I'm sorry, but who's comfortable swiping their card on a random man's phone, claiming it's for donations? That's exactly what I told him. He looked offended, but finally got out of my way. By then, I was uncomfortable and just wanted to get home. I got to the end of the block and, out of pure curiosity, decided to look back. I had a feeling he was staring at me. And he wasn't just staring at me. He had picked up his change bucket, holding it in one hand, and was standing in my direction, looking directly at me. The light changed, and it was my turn to cross the street. I hurried quickly through the intersection. I looked back after crossing and saw the Santa guy now walking in my direction. My heart started beating faster, and I began to panic, wondering if he was going to follow me. My suspicions were confirmed when I watched him press the button to cross the street. He had a small smirk on his face when he realized that I knew what he was doing. He found the fact that I was scared amusing, it seemed. I picked up the pace and walked quickly to the end of the next block until I had to wait to cross the street again. The horror truly set in as the Santa man got closer and closer. Finally, it was time to cross, and this time I took zero shame in sprinting down the sidewalk. I took a second to look back and screamed, a small scream, when I realized that he was now running towards me as well. He was laughing when I screamed, and all I wanted was to be locked away safely in my apartment. Now, I'm not the most in-shape person, and I definitely wasn't back then either, so all that running was making me completely out of breath and tired. I knew there was no way I could run all the way back to my apartment without him catching up, and I really didn't want to know what he had planned if he did catch up. So I decided to take a quick right into the diner on the corner of the street and wait for Santa to get bored and go home. I sat at the booth by the window and looked out to see if he was still following me. It seemed like 5 minutes had passed, and I didn't see him. I sighed, thinking it was finally over. I even laughed a little at the whole situation. How ridiculous it was. A Santa chasing me down the street? Must look pretty funny to someone else. Except it wasn't over. My laughing ceased when I looked out the window again, and there he was, staring at me from across the street. I changed seats so I was sitting more toward the middle of the diner, hopefully out of his view. I ordered some food and sat there for a couple of hours until the place was closing. They told me I had to leave, and walking out of that place was truly terrifying. The Santa man was no longer standing across the street, but that made it even scarier. How was I supposed to know if he was still waiting for me, lurking in the shadows somewhere? The second my feet hit the concrete of the sidewalk, I was back to sprinting. I hadn't even planned to keep running. It was like my body had a mind of its own to save itself. And thankfully it did, because I heard the sound of someone running behind me only seconds after I got going. I glanced back quickly, and there he was, Santa Man, chasing me again. Only this time, he was laughing like some psychopath. I finally reached my apartment building and swiped my card to unlock the door. Quickly, I shut it behind me, relieved that Santa Man couldn't force his way in. Drained, I climbed the stairs at a slow pace, only to hear the door buzz open again. Glancing down, I saw the Santa Man step inside. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, smirking. "Santa's here!" Then, without warning, he lunged up the steps, and the chase began once more. I was already a few flights above him, but he was quick. I got to my floor only around 10 seconds before him, but I was able to get into my apartment and lock the door behind me before he could reach me. He pounded on my door and yelled, "That wouldn't have happened if you just donated some money to the children. You're an awful person here." He kept saying that. "That'll teach you. You always donate now." And he was right. Whenever the holiday season comes, I always donate to the donation Santas every year. I never know if he's one of the men behind the mask, waiting for me to deny him, only to chase me down again. I won't risk it. I did call the police, but without a better description than Santa, there wasn't much they could do. I thought about moving, just leaving the area entirely, but instead, I decided to avoid going out much during the holiday season. I never want to see that crazy Santa again.